My name is Maren, and I'm 38 years old, and as they lowered my casket, not a single person there truly mourned me. I know because I was there, watching. Not as flesh and bone anymore, but as a quiet whisper in the cold October wind that brushed against their designer coats. The funeral was elegant, polished, expensive, painfully staged. White lilies framed the coffin, their scent sharp and artificial. The kind of funeral people attend to be seen, not to grieve. My name, carved in silver across the headstone, meant nothing to the people standing around it. Grant stood at the front, in a perfectly tailored black suit, his face carved into an imitation of sorrow. He even dabbed at his eyes with a folded handkerchief one I gave him on our 3rd anniversary. The same handkerchief that once smelled like my perfume, now used to fake the smell of loss. Beside him was Isla, my younger sister, whose arm brushed his a little too often. Her head tilted just enough for the cameras to capture the tear she carefully dabbed away. I could tell it was rehearsed. Everything about that day was rehearsed. My parents stood a little behind them. My mother, fragile and thin, clutched her pearls like a prayer. My father looked everywhere but at the coffin. It was as if acknowledging it might remind him of what he lost or perhaps what he could no longer take. The truth was simple. I had been their provider, their source of comfort, their endless supply of money. Without me, the flow stopped. That's what their silence meant, not grief, but calculation. The priest's voice droned on about peace, heaven, and forgiveness, but his words slipped through the air like empty promises. The crowd barely listened. They whispered about me, about my fortune, about who would get what now that I was gone. I caught pieces of their murmurs. She didn't have kids, right? I heard Grant gets the estate. Maybe Isla will finally move into the house. Didn't she have a trust fund? Every sentence cut deeper than the last. My death was just another business matter to them. Grant pretended to tremble when my coffin was lowered. I remember the way his hand gripped Isla's wrist, not for comfort, but control. Isla leaned into him, letting him play his role, the grieving husband, the devastated brother-in-law. I could almost hear her thoughts, see the calculation behind her carefully timed sighs. The guests murmured prayers they didn't mean, and I watched my own life being buried beneath layers of dirt and lies. It was a strange feeling, watching the end of your story unfold like a performance you never agreed to star in. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger comes later, after the shock fades and the silence settles in. What I felt in that moment was a kind of bitter amusement. They thought they'd won. They thought death had silenced me, but they didn't know the truth. My life didn't end when my heart stopped, it ended long before that. The day I realized every smile around me came with a price tag. Every hug was an investment. Every "I love you," an invoice waiting to be paid. They called me generous, selfless, kind. In reality, I was just useful. The last years of my life had been quiet, too quiet. I had built an empire from nothing, a design business that made me the woman everyone envied. But behind the walls of success, I lived among predators. The same people who once mocked my dreams now lived off them. Grant loved my wealth more than he ever loved me. Isla adored my fame until it overshadowed hers. My parents, bless their old hearts, learned to smile through resentment because my money paid their debts. And still, I gave. I gave until there was nothing left but exhaustion and regret. The rain started halfway through the burial, thin drops splattering against the casket like soft applause. No one moved to cover it. They all stood still, pretending to be overcome by emotion. But I saw Isla glance toward the lawyer standing near the back, Mr. Farnham. A man I trusted more than my own blood. He wasn't weeping. He wasn't pretending. He simply stood with a small black folder tucked beneath his arm, waiting for the charade to end. I had left him with very specific instructions. From the moment I met him, I knew he was different, discreet, loyal, and utterly unshakable. When I'd asked him months earlier if he believed in poetic justice, he'd smiled faintly and said, "Only when the author writes it herself." That's what I'd done. I'd written my ending. The crowd began to disperse once the priest closed his book. Isla adjusted her black hat, linking her arm with Grant's. My parents shuffled toward the car, whispering about what time the lawyer's meeting would start. They didn't waste a second pretending to mourn any longer. I floated, or whatever a soul does when it's unanchored above them. I watched the way Grant's lips twitched when someone mentioned my inheritance. I noticed Isla's small, greedy smile when the lawyer said the reading would take place that evening at the mansion. Even now, after everything I had done for them, not one of them had the decency to say, "She was a good person." Not one. Maybe they thought I couldn't hear them. Maybe they thought the dead don't listen. But I did. I heard every whisper, every breathless question about what I'd left behind. It was almost comforting, in a twisted way. I'd predicted every move they'd make. I knew who would show false tears, and who would stay silent. I knew who would walk out first, and who would linger for the cameras. And most of all, I knew why they came. Not for me, for my money. The first clump of dirt hit the top of my casket with a hollow thud. The sound echoed across the cemetery like punctuation, the full stop at the end of a story that had taken too long to end. But stories don't really end, do they? They just change narrators. As the last handful of dirt hit my coffin, I realized the real show hadn't even started yet. When Mr. Farnham cleared his throat, every greedy heart in that room stopped beating for a second. The evening after my funeral was exactly what I expected. A quiet masquerade of sympathy wrapped in the scent of polished wood and old money. The mansion glowed with soft golden light from the chandeliers I'd chosen myself years ago. My home, my masterpiece, now filled with people who'd already started treating it like theirs. Grant stood by the marble fireplace, sipping scotch as though he'd earned the right to relax in that room. He looked like he belonged, tall, handsome, practiced a man accustomed to pretending. Isla was draped across the velvet sofa like she was auditioning for the role of grieving sister. Her black dress was elegant, but not too modest, and she made sure Grant noticed that. My parents sat together, pretending to be composed. My mother's eyes darted between everyone else, and my father fidgeted with his cufflinks, already restless for what came next. To them, the reading of the will was not a somber occasion. It was the real main event. The funeral had just been the opening act. I drifted through the room, unseen and weightless, but I could feel the tension humming beneath the surface. They weren't just curious, they were desperate. Mr. Farnham, ever precise, stood near my old writing desk, a thick envelope resting on the polished oak. His presence alone commanded silence. He was a man of few words, but the kind whose every sentence mattered. He adjusted his glasses, checked his watch, and waited until the last murmur died out. He didn't start immediately. He just looked around the room once, his gaze deliberate. When his eyes landed on Grant, I could almost feel the air tighten. Then he spoke. "Mrs. Maren Halberg's will shall now be read in accordance with her final testament and instructions. My name, spoken with respect. Not pity, not greed. Just wait." Grant's jaw twitched. Isla straightened. My father leaned forward, and my mother pressed her lips together as if trying to suppress a grin. Farnham opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the document. The rustle of paper might as well have been thunder. "I have prepared a message to accompany the reading," he said. "Per Mrs. Halberg's request, it will be presented now." He reached for the remote, and the large flat screen in the corner flickered to life. The image appeared me. I was sitting in my study, the one they were all standing in now. The same desk, the same chair, the same light filtering through the tall windows. I was dressed in soft gray, my hair tied back neatly, and though my body was gone, my eyes looked alive, sharp, knowing, calm. "Hello," I said through the screen, and a ripple passed through the room. Isla's hand tightened on the sofa. Grant froze mid-sip. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone. And if you're here, it's because I wanted you to be." My recorded voice filled the room, every syllable deliberate. I always believed family was built on love, not convenience. But over the years, I learned that not everyone shares that belief. So before we talk about what I've left behind, I want to talk about what you've already taken. My mother's breath hitched. My father frowned, confused. Grant tried to chuckle under his breath, but it came out wrong, brittle. "You took my time, my patience, my trust," the video continued. "You took my kindness and turned it into your currency. You turned my home into a marketplace for affection, where love was traded for favors. And still, I forgave you. Again and again." Ila's composure cracked for a second. She whispered, "What is this?" under her breath, but no one answered. Grant set his glass down, too forcefully. "This is inappropriate," he muttered. He just let the video play. I smiled faintly on screen. You might think this is just theatrics, that I'm bitter or vindictive, but you should know by now I never did anything without a reason. A pause. The silence in the room grew thick. Then I leaned closer to the camera in the video. Some of you came here tonight expecting generosity. Others came expecting forgiveness. I'm sorry to disappoint you, you'll get neither. Grant's face reddened. Isla shifted uncomfortably. My parents looked at each other, unsure whether to be offended or nervous. Mr. Farnham pressed pause for a moment, his expression unreadable. As executor, he said evenly, I will now proceed with the official reading of the estate's division. He turned back to the papers. The creak of his chair was the only sound. To my husband, Grant Halberg, he began. I leave. He hesitated just enough for the suspense to settle. A letter. To be read privately after the full will is concluded. Grant's mouth opened. A letter? His voice was sharp, defensive. That's it? You're saying Mr. Farnham raised a hand. Please, Mr. Halberg. There are others mentioned. He continued. To my sister, Isla Caro, I also leave a letter. Its contents are her own to read. The silence turned icy. My parents exchanged alarmed glances. To my mother, Teresa Halberg, and my father, Royce Halberg, I leave my love and gratitude for bringing me into this world. And with it, I leave a donation in your name to the Street Augustine Care Home, an establishment that supported me during a time of great pain. You will receive acknowledgement in the charity's annual report. My father blinked. No money? My mother's lips parted in disbelief. A donation? Mr. Farnham read on, unflinching. The remainder of Mrs. Halberg's estate, including the mansion, liquid assets, and business holdings, shall be divided according to the secondary document titled Beneficiaries of the Halberg Trust. Its content will be disclosed shortly. The murmurs began immediately frantic, ugly, hissing like steam through the air. Grant turned to Isla, whispering harshly, She can't do this. I'm her husband. Isla muttered back. Maybe it's a trick. Maybe she's trying to scare us. Mr. Farnham didn't flinch. There are video addenda to this will, he said. You will want to hear them before you make assumptions. The television came back to life. My voice filled the air again, calm and certain. By now, I said in the recording, I'm sure you're wondering why I've chosen to do this the way I have. It's simple. I wanted to make sure the truth was heard while you still had to look each other in the eyes. Grant looked at Isla, then quickly away. I continued, my voice like a slow current. Some of you will find what I've done cruel, others will call it justice. Either way, it's already done. Everything you're about to hear will change what you thought you knew about me and about each other. The screen went black. The silence that followed was unbearable. Mr. Farnham folded his hands and said, There are further recordings. But before we continue, I suggest everyone prepare themselves. Grant's eyes narrowed. Prepare for what? Mr. Farnham looked at him steady, almost pitying. For the truth, Mr. Halberg. It seems your wife was quite thorough. And when my video paused, every person in that room already sensed their world was about to crumble. To understand why I did what I did, you need to know how I became their golden ticket. Long before the mansion, before the company, before the carefully hidden bitterness that filled our family dinners, I was just a small-town girl with a sketchbook full of impossible dreams. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a convenience store in Oregon, where the scent of coffee and gasoline always lingered in the air. My parents weren't cruel, people just tired, practical, and endlessly disappointed. They believed in hard work, but not in dreams. When I told them I wanted to be a designer to create spaces that felt like living art, my father laughed so hard he nearly choked on his beer. You want to decorate houses? That's not a job, Maren. That's a hobby. My mother didn't laugh. She just sighed and told me to study something sensible. Isla, 2 years younger and already the family favorite, smirked from her seat at the table. I'll be a doctor, she said. That way, at least one of us won't starve. I never forgot that. While Isla studied medicine and basked in my parents' approval, I worked part-time jobs, waitress, cashier, even cleaning houses to pay for design classes. Every dollar I earned felt like defiance. I remember sketching by candlelight, too poor to afford new bulbs, but too stubborn to stop dreaming. I promised myself that one day, they'd all see me as more than just a failure with paint under her fingernails. Success came slowly, then all at once. At 25, I landed my first big client, a boutique hotel owner who loved my work. My designs brought in attention from magazines, then investors, then bigger contracts. Within 5 years, I had my own company, Hallberg Interiors, and within 10, I was earning more than my parents and Isla combined. I bought them a new house, thinking it would bring them pride. Instead, it brought resentment. My father called it showing off. My mother said I worked too much to be truly happy. Isla, meanwhile, was drowning in student loans. Her medical career hadn't taken off the way she planned, and she came to me for help. I didn't hesitate. I paid off her debts, set her up in a new apartment, even bought her a car. She hugged me, cried, and whispered, "I'll never forget this." But she did. They all did. Money changes people, but not in the way most think. It doesn't turn good people evil, it just exposes the truth they were hiding all along. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. The fake compliments, the sudden warmth in their voices when I offered to pay for dinner, the way they'd go silent when I walked into a room, as if they were always in the middle of deciding what to ask me for next. Then came Grant. He wasn't like them, not at first. He was charming, grounded, attentive, a man who claimed to love me for my mind, not my bank account. We met at an art exhibit, where he said my designs reminded him of what silence would look like if it had color. I fell for him instantly. He made me feel seen, the kind of scene I'd been starving for my whole life. We married within 2 years. I thought I'd finally found a partner who didn't measure love in dollars. But the cracks appeared faster than I could plaster over them. Grant quit his job 6 months into the marriage, saying he wanted to support my business full-time. I didn't see it for what it was then, dependency dressed up as devotion. He began managing my finances, my calendar, my life. He insisted it was for my own good, so you can focus on creating. At first, it felt like partnership. Then it became control. I'd come home from meetings to find he'd spent thousands on networking dinners. Isla visited often, and they grew close, too close, though I refused to see it. I thought it was nice that my sister and husband got along. I was naive enough to believe affection could exist without motive. My parents basked in my success, parading me like a trophy at family gatherings. Our Maren, my mother would say proudly. She built her own company from nothing. But behind the smiles, I could feel their envy like static in the air. They never stopped comparing me to Isla, never stopped reminding me that money isn't everything. And yet, they took it. Every loan, every gift, every bailout. By 35, I was surrounded by people who smiled when I walked in but sighed when I left. Every day, I felt a little more hollow. I built beautiful homes for clients while mine felt emptier by the hour. There was one night I remember it clearly when I sat alone in my office, the city lights flickering against the glass, and realized I didn't know who actually loved me anymore. Not one person in my life, not even Grant, had shown me kindness that wasn't tied to a transaction. That realization hurt more than any betrayal could have. I started keeping a journal, not a diary, but a record. Every withdrawal, every manipulation, every lie wrapped in a thank you, I wrote it all down. I told myself it was for therapy, but part of me knew it was something else. Evidence. Evidence of how people can drain you with a smile. There was an entry I wrote a few months before everything fell apart. They've all grown comfortable feeding off me. I've created a world where they can't love me without taking from me. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe I taught them how. Those words haunted me later. Still, I kept pretending. I hosted dinners, wrote checks, and smiled through their empty laughter. I told myself that family was worth forgiving, that love meant giving even when it wasn't returned. I even believed it until one day, I decided to stop. It wasn't a single moment that changed me. It was a collection of small ones. Isla forgetting my birthday but remembering to ask for money for her new clinic. Grant telling me I should just trust him with another investment. My mother's constant sighs that, "You work too hard to be happy." The truth settled over me quietly, like dust. They didn't love me. They loved the life I gave them. And maybe I could have accepted that if they'd been honest about it. But they lied. Every day. Every smile. Every hollow word of gratitude. And then came the day I realized they loved my money more than they ever loved me. I wanted to see if their love could survive without the scent of wealth attached. It started as an idea that kept me awake at night, a whisper I couldn't ignore. What if I just stopped giving? What if the endless supply they'd grown so comfortable with suddenly ran dry? Would they still call me, visit me, love me? For months, I'd been waking up with the same ache, that hollow, unshakable feeling of being needed but never wanted. I'd been a bank account, a sponsor, a shield, but never just Maren. So one morning, I stood in front of my mirror, stared at my own tired reflection, and said aloud, "Let's find out who they really are." That was the day I started my little experiment. The first step was subtle. I told Grant that one of my major contracts had fallen through. I rehearsed the line until it sounded real, my voice shaky, my eyes downcast, a perfect imitation of vulnerability. He didn't even look up from his phone when I told him. "That's rough," he said, his tone detached. "We'll have to tighten things for a bit." Then he asked if I could still cover the credit card bill from the renovation last month. I smiled. Of course. Inside, I was already taking notes. A week later, I mentioned to my parents that business was slowing down. My mother made a sound somewhere between concern and annoyance. "You'll manage," she said. "You always do." My father simply nodded and added, "Maybe it's a sign you should cut down on your charity donations. You can't keep throwing money away, Maren." I wanted to laugh. The donations were never the problem. They were the only thing that ever felt real. Then came Isla. Sweet, self-absorbed Isla. I invited her over for lunch and told her I was struggling to make payroll for my staff. Her eyes widened, not in sympathy, but in calculation. "Oh no," she said slowly. That's terrible." A pause. Then, "Do you think you'll still be able to help with my clinic loan next month?" That's when I knew. None of them even pretended to care. They just wanted reassurance that the fountain wasn't dry. So I went further. Over the next few weeks, I staged my own downfall. I sold one of my cars, told everyone it was for liquidity. I started dressing simpler, no jewelry, no designer heels. The whispers came quickly. Isla told my mother I was probably having a midlife crisis. Grant started staying out later, claiming he was networking. My friends, or the people I'd thought were friends, stopped inviting me to brunches and charity galas. Apparently, poverty was contagious. The truth was, I'd never felt more alive. For the first time in years, I was invisible, and it was liberating. There was no one to impress, no one to fund, no one to drain me dry. One night, I overheard Grant on the phone. He was in the study, the door half open. I froze in the hallway when I heard my name. His voice was low, annoyed. "She's getting weird," he said. "If she keeps this up, we might need to start thinking about options." Options? I don't know who was on the other end of that call, but I didn't have to guess. Isla. Of course it was her. The tone, the familiarity, the quiet pauses that only existed between them. I'd been suspicious for months, the glances, the shared smiles, the nights she stayed over claiming she was too tired to drive. But that call was the first crack in the facade. I didn't confront them. Not yet. That would have ended the game too early. Instead, I made another move. The next morning, I met with Mr. Farnham. I told him everything, not about the affair, not yet, but about the experiment, about how I wanted to rewrite my will in silence. He didn't flinch, didn't question my motives. He just nodded and said, "You're certain?" "I am." That day, we began drafting the document that would become my legacy. I told him I wanted to ensure my wealth would never again feed greed, that every dollar I'd earned would serve people who deserved it, not those who drained me dry. As the weeks passed, Grant grew more distant. Isla stopped answering my calls altogether. My parents sent fewer texts, their messages now reduced to reminders about upcoming bills or emergency expenses. I began to test them more directly. I called Isla one morning and told her, voice trembling, that I might have to sell the mansion to stay afloat. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Oh, that's a shame. I guess you'll move in with Grant's parents for a while?" That was all. No offer to help, no concern, just detachment. When I hung up, I felt strangely peaceful. The truth wasn't pretty, but at least it was clear. I started spending more time alone in the house, listening to its echoes. The silence no longer scared me, it comforted me. I'd spent years filling every quiet space with people who pretended to care. Now, the emptiness felt honest. Hannah, my assistant, was the only person who didn't treat me differently. She still showed up every morning with coffee and her soft smile. When I told her about my financial trouble, she didn't ask for details. She just said, "I know you'll figure it out, you always do." It was the only genuine kindness I'd felt in months. That night, I sat by the fireplace with a notebook and wrote, "They failed the test. Every single one of them. Now I know what love isn't." By the time Grant finally confronted me about my money issues, his tone was more accusation than concern. "You're not telling me everything," he said, his voice sharp. "Are you hiding something?" I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Yes." He blinked, startled, but before he could ask what, I smiled and walked away. From that night on, I knew my marriage was over. The sisterhood I'd once cherished was gone. My parents' affection was in dot of internal mea, illusion. And the woman they all depended on, the generous, forgiving, wealthy Maren, she was gone too. What was left was something colder, quieter, stronger. The kind of strength that only comes after you stop trying to be loved by the wrong people. I went to bed that night with a strange calm in my chest. It wasn't joy or victory, just relief. The truth had finally shown itself, and I didn't need to pretend anymore. That's when I decided, if they wanted my money more than my heart, then they'd get neither. The truth didn't come in whispers, it came in pictures. They arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, slipped into my life like a blade under the door. An unmarked envelope, left on the front step of my mansion, damp around the corners from the drizzle. No return address, no note, just my name, written in black ink. I remember the strange calm I felt as I picked it up. I wasn't suspicious, not yet, maybe a client's thank you card, or a delivery mix-up. But the moment I tore it open, the air in the room seemed to shift. Inside were photographs. Grant, Isla, together. Not at a family dinner or a public event, but in moments that no camera should have witnessed. The first few were subtle, almost innocent. A hand resting too long on a shoulder. A shared look across a restaurant table. The intimacy of laughter that only lovers share. But the deeper I went into the stack, the worse it became. A hotel room. His shirt unbuttoned. Her lipstick smudged. My fingers trembled. My lungs forgot how to work. I sank to the floor. The pictures spilling around me like the ashes of my old life. For a long moment, there was no thought, just sound. The distant ticking of the clock. The muffled thunder outside. The slow, rhythmic collapse of something breaking inside me. I didn't cry. Not right away. I didn't scream or curse or call anyone. I just sat there, staring at the evidence of the betrayal I'd been too blind to see. Every late night, every unexplained phone call, every business trip that overlapped with Isla's conferences. It all fit now, perfectly, painfully. I'd tested their love, and they'd failed. But this was worse than failure. It was annihilation. When I finally moved, it wasn't rage that guided me. It was precision. I gathered the photos neatly, slid them back into the envelope, and placed it on my desk. Then I poured myself a glass of wine, not to numb myself, but to steady my hands. My world had just imploded, but for the first time, I saw everything clearly. The lies weren't new. They'd just been waiting for me to notice them. I thought about every sacrifice I'd made for those two. The years of support, the money, the second chances. The way I'd defended them to anyone who dared question their intentions. I'd spent years building a life they could parasitize, and they'd thanked me by sharing a bed behind my back. That night, I didn't sleep. I just watched the rain trace lines down the window and wondered how long it had been happening, how many family dinners they'd smiled through, hiding their guilt behind polite laughter. By dawn, my sorrow had turned into steel. I called Mr. Farnham and asked him to come to the house immediately. He arrived within the hour, raincoat still dripping, briefcase in hand. When I showed him the photos, he didn't flinch. He just nodded once, his face set in quiet understanding. "I'll need to make changes to the will," I said, my voice cold and even. "Everything must be rewritten." He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. We worked for hours, clause by clause. We stripped Grant and Isla from every part of my estate. I redirected my assets toward people and causes that had meaning: charities, shelters, scholarships, places where my money could actually heal something instead of feeding rot. When it was done, Farnham looked up at me and said, "You're certain you want no reconciliation?" I smiled faintly. "I've already reconciled, Mr. Farnham, just not with them." After he left, I began to record. Not because I wanted revenge, though part of me did, but because I wanted my truth preserved. I wanted my voice to outlive their lies. I set up a small camera in my study, pressed record, and spoke. At first, my voice trembled. I talked about betrayal, about love that becomes poison. I talked about the pain of realizing that the people closest to you had already buried you emotionally long before death could. Then, as the words poured out, I found strength. I spoke about forgiveness not as a gift to them, but as a release for myself. That recording became the beginning of the video they would later see at the will reading, the one that silenced their whispers and made them look at each other with fear. But that was still months away. For now, the betrayal was still fresh, an open wound that bled beneath every polite smile. I didn't confront them immediately. I wanted to watch them unravel, to see how long they could pretend before their guilt devoured them. Grant came home late that night, smelling faintly of Isla's perfume, a scent I'd bought her myself one Christmas. He kissed my cheek like nothing was wrong. "Rough day?" he asked casually. I stared at him for a long moment, my stomach twisting. "You could say that." He poured himself a drink, unaware that his entire life had just been rewritten in legal ink. Isla called later, her tone chirpy, pretending to check in. I answered calmly, as if nothing had changed. Playing along was easier than I thought it would be. Maybe because I'd spent years doing it without realizing, but something inside me shifted permanently that night. The woman who had always sought approval, who'd tolerated humiliation for the sake of peace, she died. The one who replaced her wasn't broken. She was deliberate. Over the next few days, I watched them carefully. Every interaction became a study in deceit. Grant avoiding eye contact when I mentioned Isla. Isla sending messages late at night. Her smile too forced whenever she spoke of him. They thought I was still in the dark. They had no idea I'd already written their ending. When I closed my eyes at night, I no longer saw their betrayal, I saw the future. A clean slate. A life where they could no longer drain me. I began putting away personal belongings, donating jewelry and dresses to women's shelters. Every item I gave away felt like shedding another layer of my old self. The staff noticed the change in me. Hannah asked quietly one day, "Are you okay?" I smiled at her genuinely, for once. Better than ever. Inside, I felt the kind of peace that comes only after devastation, the calm that follows the storm, when there's nothing left to lose and everything left to build. I knew then that my revenge wouldn't be about screaming or punishing. It would be about silence, the kind that speaks louder than any outburst, the kind that rewrites legacies. That night, after they'd both lied to me again, I poured myself another glass of wine and whispered to the empty room, "You wanted everything that was mine. Now you'll get what you deserve, absolutely nothing." That night, as they slept together under my roof, I drafted the words that would haunt them forever. I started dying in their eyes long before I actually died. After the envelope and the recording, everything in my life became theater. Every breath I took, every word I spoke, was a line in a script only I knew existed. The difference between life and death, I realized, isn't always heartbeat or breath, it's awareness. Once you've seen people's true faces, there's no going back to pretending you're blind. I woke up one morning and decided to let them believe what they wanted. If they saw me as weak, sick, fragile, that was fine. In fact, it was perfect. Because the weaker they thought I was, the less they'd see what I was doing. The first step was medical. I began missing events, canceling meetings, moving slower, coughing into tissues that I later flushed down the drain. When Grant asked what was wrong, I said, "Just exhaustion." I smiled, small and sad. He didn't reach for me. He just sighed. "Try to rest. We can't afford another hospital bill." That told me everything I needed to know. Then I called Mr. Farnham. I told him I was updating my estate plan again, precautionary, I said, as though I were suddenly concerned about my health. He understood immediately. He never pried, never asked for details about the game I was playing. He simply said, "I'll have everything ready." And he did. Together we built the new framework of my life and my afterlife. I set up a charitable trust, quietly moved money into causes I believed in, and created sealed instructions for distribution. Every transaction, every clause, every line was deliberate. I wanted to make sure that when the curtain fell, there would be no loopholes, no appeals, no way for them to crawl back into the wealth they'd taken for granted. All of it required secrecy, precision, and patience. I learned to speak in two languages, one for them, one for me. To them, I was the fading wife and sister. To myself, I was the architect of a quiet reckoning. Ela came by one afternoon, carrying flowers and pity in equal measure. "You should see a doctor," she said sweetly, her voice syrupy with concern. "You've lost weight." I smiled. Stress does that to people. She looked around the room, scanning the shelves like a thief taking inventory. You'll be fine, she added. You always are. She was wrong. I wasn't fine. I was finished, at least. The version of me they knew was. Hannah, on the other hand, saw through everything. She noticed how I was giving away furniture, donating clothes, spending hours writing letters. One day she stopped by my desk and said, "You're planning something, aren't you?" I looked up at her and, for the first time in weeks, told the truth. Yes. She didn't ask what, she didn't need to. She just nodded. And in that small act of understanding, I knew I'd chosen the right person to trust. I began recording again, longer this time. More personal. I spoke directly to the camera, not as a victim, but as someone who'd finally woken up. I talked about how love becomes a weapon when placed in greedy hands, about how silence can be louder than revenge, about how peace is something you sometimes have to earn by burning bridges. Each night after recording, I sealed a USB copy in an envelope marked with a name: Grant, Isla, Mother, Father. Letters, videos, documents, all locked in Mr. Farnham's care. My plan wasn't about cruelty, it was about clarity. I wanted them to see the truth one last time, unfiltered, undeniable, final. Grant started to notice my detachment. One evening, he confronted me in the kitchen. "You've changed," he said, watching me slice vegetables with slow precision. "You barely talk to me anymore." I kept my tone even. "I've been thinking a lot about the future." He gave a bitter laugh. "What future? We're barely keeping things together." "Exactly," I said quietly. He frowned. "You mean financially?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Silence was enough to make him nervous. He hated silence because he couldn't manipulate it. Words were his tools. I'd taken them away. After that night, he spent even less time at home. Isla filled the space he left behind, her visits shorter but colder. Sometimes I'd hear them whispering in the hallway, their voices low, their guilt leaking through their tones. I no longer needed confirmation of the affair. I'd already seen enough. What I needed now was closure, and I wasn't waiting for death to give it to me. I scheduled one last appointment with my doctor, an actual one this time. The results came back unremarkable. I was healthy, strong even, but I let them believe otherwise. When Grant asked, I said quietly, "It's serious." He froze. For the first time in months, I saw something almost human flicker across his face, not love but calculation. "How serious?" "Serious enough that you should start planning ahead," I said. He nodded slowly, then asked, "What about the will?" That was his first question. Not, "Will you be okay?" Not, "What can I do?" Just the will. I smiled to myself when he left the room. The performance was working. In the days that followed, I completed every remaining detail. Mr. Farnham and I finalized the legal framework. Hannah helped me organize my records. The mansion, once filled with guests and laughter, grew quieter with each passing day. I spent my last evening before vanishing in my study, candlelight flickering across the letters spread out before me. One for each of them. Every line crafted not to wound, but to reveal. I wrote about the love I once felt, the pain they caused, and the peace I'd found in letting go. When I finished, I sealed each envelope, pressed a wax stamp into them, and whispered to myself, "Now it's done." For the first time in years, I slept soundly. In the following weeks, I made it easy for them to think I was fading. I withdrew from work entirely, told everyone I needed rest. I stopped answering calls. I canceled dinner plans. My absence was gradual enough to seem natural. And when I finally did die, when my body gave out from exhaustion and heartbreak, they were shocked, but not surprised. I had scripted my death so perfectly that it felt like they'd seen it coming all along. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that my final breath wasn't the end of me, it was the beginning of their reckoning. Because death, for me, wasn't escape. It was execution. When I finally took my last breath, I did it knowing my silence would speak louder than their greed. When my lawyer pressed play on the next video, the room stopped breathing. Mr. Farnham stood beside the television, one hand resting on the remote, the other gripping the folder that held what was left of my life on paper. Around him, my family sat scattered like chess pieces after a long, messy game, every move calculated, every expression brittle. Grant was the first to break the silence. "This is absurd," he muttered. We've already seen one video. How many more are there? Mr. Farnham adjusted his glasses. 3 in total. Each pertains to a different section of Mrs. Hallberg's estate and personal testimony. Testimony? Isla scoffed, though her voice cracked halfway through. She makes it sound like a trial. It is, in a sense, he replied calmly. A trial of conscience. Then he pressed play. The screen flickered, and my face appeared again, older than in the first recording, paler, but sharper, as if time had carved away all softness. I sat at my desk, the same room they were sitting in now. The same sunlight slanted across the curtains. Hello again, I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. If you're still watching, then you've already heard what I think of love built on convenience. But there's something else you deserve to hear, the truth you all worked so hard to hide. Grant shifted in his chair, jaw tightening. Isla folded her arms, trying to look indifferent. My mother whispered a prayer under her breath. I smiled faintly on the screen. Grant, you always said honesty was the foundation of a good marriage. I agree. Which is why I left you something honest, your own words. Mr. Farnham pressed a button, and the video cut to another clip, grainy footage from a hidden camera I'd installed months before. The sound crackled before it sharpened into clarity. Grant's voice. She's getting worse. Once she's gone, the company's mine anyway. Then, Isla's reply. We just have to make sure she signs everything over. She trusts you. The room imploded in silence. Isla shot to her feet. That's fake! She edited that. But Mr. Farnham shook his head. Timestamped. Verified and sealed under court-certified documentation. Grant went pale, his knuckles white on the armrest. This is private, she had no right. The video cut again to photographs. The same ones that had shattered me. Each image appeared slowly, methodically, leaving no room for denial. Gasps rippled through the room. My mother turned away, covering her mouth. My father muttered a curse. I spoke again from the screen, voice low but steady. You both took my trust, my marriage, my family, and you turned them into something filthy. I'm not angry anymore. Anger requires love, and you spent every ounce of it long ago. All I have left is truth, and truth is merciless. Grant stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. Turn it off! I won't listen to this. Mr. Farnham's tone didn't change. You'll sit, Mr. Hallberg. She asked that no one leave until the full message was delivered. Saturday. Not because he respected the lawyer, but because every eye in the room was on him now. Judging, whispering, piecing together the story that was no longer just rumor. On the screen, I continued, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Grant, you once told me you loved me because I made you feel seen. The irony is, I saw you all along. I just didn't want to believe it. The camera panned slightly. I was holding something in my hand, a ring. This was supposed to symbolize loyalty. Instead, it became evidence of betrayal. So I leave it where it belongs with nothing. I dropped it into an empty glass bowl. The sharp clang echoed through the speakers. Then I turned my gaze toward Isla. As for you, my darling sister, my mirror, my shadow you wanted, everything I had. You took what you could, even the one thing that wasn't yours to take. So I'll give you something you can truly keep, my forgiveness. But forgiveness doesn't come with fortune. The video froze for a moment on my face. Then the screen went black. Silence. It was Isla who broke it, her voice shrill and trembling. She can't do this. I'm her only sister. Mr. Farnham calmly opened the next document. Per Mrs. Hallberg's will, the entirety of her personal and business estate, including her residence and assets, are hereby transferred to the Hallberg Foundation, an independent charitable trust dedicated to supporting women in need. Grant's mouth fell open. That's impossible. She can't just, she can. The lawyer interrupted. She did. He continued reading. To Hannah Rhodes, her assistant and confidant, Mrs. Hallberg leaves a portion of her personal savings and full administrative rights to the Hallberg Foundation. The remainder shall be distributed among registered charities as specified in Appendix C. Hannah, sitting quietly near the back, covered her mouth in shock. Her eyes glistened not from greed, but from something deeper. Gratitude. Grant slammed his fist against the table. This is a joke! She was manipulated. You all took advantage of her. On the contrary, Mr. Farnham said. Every document was prepared and signed in my presence. Mrs. Hallberg was of sound mind and purpose. There are recordings verifying each decision. My mother spoke softly, trembling. Maren, why would you do this to your family? On the television, the screen flickered back to life. My face returned, answering the question none of them deserved an answer to. Because family doesn't take from you until you're empty and still call it love. The room went utterly still. In that moment, every person there looked smaller, Grant's confidence crumbling, Isla's vanity cracking, my parents' self-righteousness deflating into shame. They had come expecting an inheritance. They were walking away with a mirror. I had taken everything they valued and turned it into reflection. Grant leaned forward, his voice low, venomous. You think this makes you noble? You think this makes you win? Mr. Farnham closed the folder and looked at him steadily. She's not here to win, Mr. Hallberg. She's here to end the game. He pressed one final button on the remote. My image appeared once more, smiling faintly. By now, you've probably realized the truth that you can't inherit what was never yours. Love, loyalty, respect, those were the real treasures, and you sold them long ago. Then I added, softly, this is your inheritance now, the truth, the silence, and the memory of what you destroyed. The screen faded to black. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the air in the room seemed to collapse. And as my final line echoed through the room, Grant realized he'd been completely erased from my legacy. I didn't want my money to rot with them, I wanted it to grow where kindness lived. When the shouting finally stopped, all that remained in the room was the sound of paper rustling. Mr. Farnham's steady voice cut through the tension, each word deliberate, measured, and final. This section, he said, tapping the page with his fountain pen, details the individuals and causes Mrs. Hallberg personally selected as beneficiaries of her estate. Grant and Isla sat frozen, their faces pale and drawn, while my parents looked as though they were waking from a dream, the kind that feels sweet until you realize it's over. The air around them had shifted. There was no grief left, no entitlement to disguise their disappointment, only disbelief. I had spent the last year of my life choosing where my wealth would go. Every dollar, every asset, every belonging had been redirected towards someone or something that reminded me of the version of myself that still believed in goodness. I wanted my legacy to belong to those who understood what love looked like when it wasn't attached to profit. Mr. Farnham continued reading. Per Mrs. Hallberg's instructions, the Hallberg Foundation will receive the full deed to the estate, including the residence and surrounding grounds, to be converted into a transitional housing and educational center for women and children escaping financial and emotional abuse. The words landed heavy in the room. Even from beyond the grave, I could feel their sting. That mansion, my pride, their obsession would no longer serve as a monument to greed, but as a refuge for survival. I imagined the rooms that once echoed with lies now filled with laughter, lessons, and second chances. I saw the dining hall, once used for empty family dinners, becoming a shared kitchen where women could gather, cook, and rebuild their lives. The thought brought me peace, even in death. Grant's jaw clenched. You can't be serious. She's giving away the house? The entire property? Mr. Farnham didn't look up from the document. The entire property, yes. Along with the adjoining land. All ownership is transferred to the foundation immediately upon certification of death. My father spoke next, his voice cracking with disbelief. But she knew this house was family history. Correction, Mr. Farnham said calmly. It was hers, and she redefined what family meant. Then came the next name. To Miss Hannah Rhodes, Mr. Farnham read. For her loyalty, compassion, and unshakable integrity, I leave the sum of $2 million, along with full directorship of the Hallberg Foundation. A soft gasp escaped from the back of the room. Hannah, who had been sitting quietly until now, covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. She whispered something under her breath. Maybe my name, but she didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply pressed her hand to her heart and nodded. That's why I chose her. While others circled me like vultures, Hannah had stayed because she cared. She never asked for more than her job required. She brought me coffee, asked how I was feeling, and actually meant it. She once told me, I don't work for you, Maren. I work with you. Those small words had meant more than every grand gesture my family had ever performed. Grant sneered at her from across the room. So that's it, huh? You're the saint now? The secretary gets everything? Hannah shook her head slowly, still in shock. No, she didn't do this for me. She did it for herself. Mr. Farnham continued, unbothered by the rising hostility. The Hallberg Foundation will also establish the Isla Caro Scholarship Fund, a fully endowed scholarship program for women pursuing medical education, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Isla blinked in confusion. A scholarship? She said weakly. In my name? Yes, the lawyer said, turning a page. Funded entirely by your sister's estate. However, none of its proceeds or recognition shall ever transfer to you personally. It is meant as both tribute and reminder. The color drained from Isla's face. A reminder of what? Mr. Farnham looked at her evenly. Of what she once believed you could have been. I had written that clause carefully. Isla once wanted to heal people. She wanted to be a doctor for the right reasons until money and validation became her real patients. The scholarship in her name wasn't revenge. It was redemption. Gifted to strangers she'd never meet, but who might live out the version of her that died long ago. The lawyer turned to the next page. In addition, Mrs. Hallberg requested the creation of an annual grant titled the Teresa and Royce Initiative, honoring her parents. The program will provide housing and medical support for elderly couples who have fallen on hard times. My parents looked stunned. My mother's lip trembled. My father whispered, She honored us? She did? Farnham said, his tone softening slightly. But note the clause. The initiative's purpose is to assist those who, and I quote, understand that love is a form of service, not transaction. My mother broke down then, sobbing quietly. Maybe she finally understood what that meant. There were smaller gifts too, ones I'd tucked into the details. My personal library was donated to a local women's college. My art collection was auctioned, with proceeds funding art therapy programs. My jewelry, each piece carrying a memory, was melted down and redesigned into simple pendants for survivors of abuse. Every item found a new home, not one that worshipped wealth, but one that respected meaning. The more Mr. Farnham read, the quieter the room became. Grant's protests faded into silence. Isla's tears stopped flowing. My parents sat still, listening, maybe for the first time in years, really listening. When he finally closed the folder, the air seemed to shift again. He cleared his throat. There is one final clause before we proceed to the remaining recordings. Grant's head snapped up. What clause? Mr. Farnham's gaze was steady. It pertains to the disbursement of personal letters addressed to each of you. Per her request, these letters are to be read privately and in full. They contain no financial instructions, only her final words. The color drained from Grant's face. Isla flinched. My mother looked down at her lap, afraid to meet anyone's eyes. In that moment, I felt it, the transformation. My death had turned from tragedy to lesson. Every person in that room had walked in thinking they'd be richer by the end of the night. They left poorer than ever, stripped of illusions, forced to face themselves. But the real punishment wasn't losing my money, it was what they were about to lose next. They thought the will was the end, but I'd only just begun. Mr. Farnham handed each of them a sealed envelope, thick, ivory, and stamped with the same wax seal I'd used for every letter I'd written before my death, the same imprint of an hourglass encircled by thorns. I chose it for a reason. Time reveals everything, and truth always hurts. Grant stared at his envelope like it might explode. Isla hesitated before taking hers, her trembling hands betraying the calm expression she tried to maintain. My parents accepted theirs quietly, as if holding something sacred and dangerous all at once. This concludes the formal reading, Mr. Farnham said, his tone even. The letters are personal, and per Mrs. Hallberg's wishes, I will take my leave once they are distributed. He gathered his briefcase, gave Hannah a small nod, but just before leaving, he paused and said softly, For what it's worth, I admired her greatly. Then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that crackled like electricity. They didn't open the envelopes immediately. No one wanted to be the first. But curiosity and fear are twin beasts, and it didn't take long for one of them to win. Grant ripped his open first. The sound of tearing paper echoed through the room. I had started his letter with a simple line. You told me once that honesty mattered more to you than love. I finally took your advice. Grant's lips moved as he read, though no sound came out. His eyes darted across the page, faster, sharper, until his face began to redden. Then he stopped. His hands shook. This is insane, he muttered. Isla glanced over nervously. What does it say? He looked at her, his expression twisting. She knew everything. She froze. What do you mean? Grant threw the letter down, the pages scattering. My words spilled across the floor like ghosts finally released from their prison. I had written to him not as a lover, not as a victim, but as a witness. Every line of that letter was a confession of what I'd seen and a verdict for what I'd endured. I knew about the affair long before the photos reached me. I watched the way you looked at her, the way your voice softened when you spoke her name. I told myself it was my imagination. I wanted to believe you were incapable of that kind of betrayal. But I was wrong. You were always capable. I just refused to see it. He tried to gather the pages, but one slipped near Isla's feet. She bent down to pick it up and, against her better judgment, began to read it aloud. I don't hate you, Grant. Hate would mean you still matter. What I feel is freedom, the kind that comes when a lie finally suffocates under its own weight. You taught me that love without loyalty is just debt, and I've paid mine in full. Grant snatched the paper from her hands. Stop it, he shouted. But it was too late. Isla's face had gone pale, because she knew her turn was next. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she opened her own letter. Inside were several neatly folded pages and a smaller envelope with her name written in gold ink. She hesitated before opening the smaller one. It contained a single photograph, the two of them together, laughing, caught unaware. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. Dear Isla, I'd written. You were the one I trusted most. The one I believed would always protect me. But you learned early that it's easier to stand beside power than to build it yourself. You could have had your own success, your own name. Instead, you borrowed mine until you couldn't tell where I ended and you began. Her eyes welled up, and for a moment she seemed to forget everyone else was watching. She whispered the next part under her breath, but the words still carried. I forgive you, Isla. But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. I'll never forget that when I needed a sister, you were too busy being someone else's secret, Grant. I turned away, jaw clenched. My mother wiped tears from her cheeks, whispering prayers that couldn't reach me now. Then my father opened his envelope. His hands were steadier than the others, but his face grew older with every sentence he read. Father, I had written, you taught me to be strong. You also taught me that strength, in your eyes, was measured in silence, that pain should be endured, not acknowledged. You made me believe that love had to be earned. I spent my whole life earning it. I hope one day, you realize it was already yours to give. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. My mother opened hers next. Mother, my words began. You said often that I was too generous. You were right. I gave too much, but not because I wanted to show off. I gave because I wanted someone to give back. You could have been that person. I wish you had been. By the time she reached the end, she was sobbing openly. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly, like a woman finally seeing her reflection in a mirror she'd avoided for too long. The letters weren't written to destroy them, they were written to expose them. To hold up a truth so sharp it couldn't be ignored. I hadn't planned revenge through violence or scandal. I'd planned it through remembrance, through words that would linger long after my voice was gone. Hannah stepped forward then, her eyes glistening. She carried a final folder in her hands, one Mr. Farnham had left with her. There's one more thing, she said softly. Maren wanted these to be shared publicly. She placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printed documents, bank statements, emails, and legal affidavits, all proving Grant's misuse of company funds, his embezzlement, and his forged signatures. Every line was time-stamped, notarized, undeniable. The silence turned suffocating. Isla's voice broke the stillness. This will ruin us. Hannah looked at her gently. It's already done. She made sure of it. Grant stood there, motionless, as the truth finally reached him, the kind that no amount of denial could bury. By the next morning, the story hit the news. Widow's will exposes husband's fraud. Family scandal shakes Hallberg legacy. Headlines everywhere. Their social circles collapsed overnight. The empire they'd built on lies came crashing down, just as I'd designed. And from wherever I was, beyond pain, beyond life, I felt something close to peace. And as the headlines spread, my name finally meant something honest, not rich, but righteous. Everything they built on lies began to fall apart. After the will reading and the exposure of the documents, the world that Grant, Isla, and my parents had constructed, the fragile illusion of decency, shattered like glass dropped from a great height. There was no graceful descent, just noise, chaos, and ruin. Within a week, their names were plastered across every news site, every gossip feed. The same cameras that once followed them at charity galas now followed them to courthouses. The headlines that once praised our perfect family now labeled them traitors, thieves, and frauds. I watched from beyond, a silent observer to the collapse I had long foreseen. Grant was the first to fall. His company accounts were frozen after investigators uncovered the paper trail I had meticulously prepared. The proof of his embezzlement, hidden transfers, secret loans, forged signatures, was airtight. The authorities didn't even need a search warrant. Every file had already been delivered by Mr. Farnham. My fingerprints weren't on any of it, only his. It was poetic. He was arrested one quiet morning. The press surrounded him as he left the house, his face pale, eyes bloodshot. "It's all a misunderstanding," he shouted, voice cracking. But even he didn't sound like he believed it. Isla didn't show up at the police station. She was already trying to save herself. While Grant sat in a holding cell, Isla faced her own reckoning. The medical board opened an inquiry into her clinic after the scholarship announcement brought her name back into the public eye. Donations and patient payments were traced, and what they found was damning unfiled taxes, falsified claims, and unethical prescriptions. The woman who once prided herself on healing others was revealed as someone who couldn't heal her own greed. Her license was suspended within days. The media swarmed her apartment demanding statements, apologies, explanations. She gave none. The bright, confident doctor she once pretended to be was replaced by a ghost, a hollow reflection of ambition gone wrong. And my parents, they were quieter in their downfall, but theirs was perhaps the most painful. Their community, the same one they'd bragged to for years about their successful daughter, turned its back on them. The Teresa and Royce initiative opened under the Hallberg Foundation's care, and when their neighbors read the dedication plaque, the irony was inescapable. The charity bearing their names was designed for the very people they used to look down upon. I imagined them visiting the center for the first time, standing under the banner with their names in bronze, reading the words, "For those who gave more love than they ever received." It wasn't vengeance. It was reflection. I wanted them to understand that love without humility corrodes, and that money without compassion poisons everything it touches. Hannah, meanwhile, carried the foundation forward with quiet grace. The mansion, once filled with whispers and deceit, became a home again, not for greed, but for healing. The rooms echoed with laughter, children's footsteps, and stories of women rebuilding from broken places. She wrote to Mr. Farnham weekly, updating him on every success. "It's working," she wrote once. "The walls that once held pain now hold hope." I liked to imagine she was right. In contrast, Grant spiraled. Without access to money or allies, he was forced to face the life he'd built, one without meaning, one without truth. He pled guilty to reduced charges, more out of exhaustion than remorse. His once charming smile was now a grimace, his name synonymous with scandal. When his sentence was announced, no one came to support him. Not Isla, not my parents. He was utterly alone the way he had made me feel for years. Isla tried to rebuild her reputation, but it was too late. Patients withdrew, friends ghosted her, sponsors vanished. Even in her isolation, she refused to take responsibility. She blamed Grant for everything, and in her letters to the media, she painted herself as a victim of manipulation. But I'd left proof that contradicted every word. The truth always survives, even when people try to bury it. As the months passed, their anger gave way to shame, and their shame to silence. For the first time, they stopped speaking of me not out of guilt, but because every mention of my name reminded them of what they'd lost. And what they lost wasn't just wealth, it was belonging. It was the illusion that they were good people. The Hallberg name, once gilded by my success, became a cautionary tale. Students at business schools studied my case, the woman who built an empire of beauty and left behind a legacy of truth. My foundation grew stronger each month, attracting donors who believed in what I believed, that generosity means nothing without empathy. In the mansion's garden, Hannah planted a tree, a silver birch. She said it was for me. She placed a small plaque at its base. For Maren, she turned endings into beginnings. Sometimes, I imagine walking through that garden, seeing the sunlight spill through its leaves, watching women carry their children across the grass. That house was once filled with betrayal. Now it was a sanctuary. Maybe that's all I ever wanted to know, that my pain would build something better than itself. Grant eventually served his time and was released quietly. No fanfare, no redemption arc. He lived in a small apartment downtown, unseen, forgotten. Occasionally, tabloids caught him on camera, older, tired, eyes hollow. People would scroll past the pictures, barely remembering who he was. Isla moved away not long after, leaving no forwarding address. Rumors said she tried to start a clinic abroad, but it failed within a year. My parents aged quickly. The charity in their name thrived, and though they accepted the public praise, they never escaped the private guilt. My mother visited my grave once every spring, leaving the same white lilies she used to bring to my house. Maybe she hoped that gesture would make up for the years she didn't understand me. Maybe it did. I had wanted justice, but what I found was peace, the slow, quiet peace that comes when truth does the work for you. I didn't have to haunt them. They haunted themselves. Hannah sent flowers to my grave too, not lilies, but sunflowers. She said they reminded her of how I used to turn toward the light even when surrounded by shadows. It's strange, isn't it? The way greed collapses under its own weight, while love, genuine love, endures even when you're gone. And as the world forgot their names, my story began to live forever. She was the only one who didn't need to love me for my wealth. When I first hired Hannah, she was 26, quiet, and painfully shy. I'd just lost another assistant to burnout, and the agency sent her as a replacement. She didn't have much experience, but she had a way of listening that made even silence feel like company. I remember asking her in the interview, "Why do you want this job?" And she said, "Because I want to help someone build something that lasts." I didn't realize then that she would become the only person who truly did. In the years that followed, she saw every version of me, the tired one, the frustrated one, the generous fool. Unlike the others, she never asked for a raise, never hinted for favors. She'd come early, stay late, and somehow still remember the small things. My favorite tea, the song I hummed when I worked. She treated me like a person, not an opportunity. It seems like such a simple thing, but after years surrounded by users, it felt revolutionary. When the news of my will and the foundation went public, reporters swarmed her like bees to honey. They wanted a scandal, a soundbite, a secret. Hannah gave them none. She stood outside the mansion gates, calm and composed, and simply said, "Maren Hallberg wanted to build hope. That's all anyone needs to know." And just like that, she silenced the noise that my family had fed for years. The mansion changed quickly under her care. The ornate drapes came down, replaced by sunlight. The walls that once echoed with polite laughter and hidden resentment now carried the sound of children learning to laugh again. She turned the ballroom into a classroom, my office into a counseling space, and my old bedroom into a library where every woman who came through the doors could sign her name in a book that read, "You belong here." Each week, she wrote letters to the trustees, signing them for Maren. I liked to imagine her doing it at my old desk, the same one where I wrote the letters that sealed my family's fate. Only hers were filled with beginnings, not endings. My parents visited the foundation once, timid and trembling. They thought they'd be turned away, but Hannah welcomed them kindly. She showed them around the building, explained the programs, and led them to the plaque in the garden where the birch tree grew tall. My mother cried when she saw my name beside the words, "For those who rise from the ashes." My father said nothing, but when they left, he slipped a folded check into the donation box. It wasn't much, but it was something, a start. Grant never came. Isla did once. She stood outside the gate for hours, watching the children play in the yard. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't ask to go inside. When she finally left, Hannah found a note tucked under the gate that read, "She was always better than me." Hannah placed it in a sealed envelope and kept it in the office, among the files that chronicled the foundation's history. Years passed, and the world moved on, as it always does. But Hannah never stopped keeping her promise to me. She expanded the foundation to other cities, partnering with shelters and training centers. My name became less about wealth and more about rebuilding. Every anniversary of my death, she held a small ceremony in the garden. No speeches, no photographers, just women sharing stories of how their lives had changed. That was all the legacy I wanted. I often wonder if Hannah ever felt the weight of what I left her. Managing a foundation, living in a house haunted by memories, it's a heavy inheritance. but she carried it with the same quiet grace she brought to everything else. When the board offered her more power, she declined the title of executive director. She preferred caretaker. She said it suited her better. There's one particular evening I like to imagine, years after my passing. The mansion is quiet, the sun setting beyond the birch tree. Hannah sits by the window of my old study, reading through letters from women who've been helped by the foundation. Each one begins the same way. Dear Maren. Though they've never met me. She smiles softly, knowing that my story, our story, still lives in those words. On the desk lies one letter she's never mailed. It's addressed to me. I know what it says because I've felt its words forming every day since my death. You taught me that love isn't a transaction, it's a choice. You taught me that truth can outlive pain. You taught me that even broken things can be rebuilt into something beautiful. I promise I'll keep rebuilding for you. That was her promise, the quiet vow of someone who understood what legacy truly meant. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her that she was never my employee. She was my friend, my mirror, my redemption. She's the reason I can rest peacefully, knowing that everything I built won't be twisted by greed again. She once told a reporter, Maren's story isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming meaning. I think she was right. The world remembered my name because of scandal, but it kept remembering because of her. She took my tragedy and turned it into a lifeline for others. In the end, love didn't come from bloodlines or marriage vows. It came from a quiet woman who saw through my walls and stayed anyway. That's what real family looks like, not the ones who share your name, but the ones who share your heart. If there's such a thing as heaven, I don't think it's clouds or angels. I think it's moments like these, watching the life you once feared had no meaning bloom into something good. Watching someone keep your promise alive. So, if she ever wonders whether she did enough, I hope she hears me when I whisper the truth she already knows. Because even in death, I wanted her to know she was my greatest investment. They said strange things started happening in my old house after that. The mansion had always carried echoes, even when I was alive. Its high ceilings and marble floors swallowed sound and reflected it back in whispers. But after my death, those whispers became something else entirely softer, deeper, alive. Some called it haunting. I called it memory refusing to fade. When Hannah officially turned the estate into the Hallberg home for renewal, the first thing she did was open every window. She told the staff it was to let the light in, but she later admitted she felt a strange heaviness when she lighter why. First stepped inside. It wasn't dark, she said, just waiting. At night, the creaks and murmurs of the old house grew louder. The women who stayed there whispered stories about hearing footsteps in the halls after midnight, or catching the faint scent of jasmine, my perfume, when the rooms were empty. Some claimed they felt a presence watching over them, gentle but firm, like someone making sure they were safe. I suppose in a way, they were right. The house had absorbed too much of my life to ever truly let me go. My laughter was in its walls, my tears in the floorboards, my last breaths in its air. So I stayed. Not in a way that frightened, but in a way that protected. The mansion had been my cage, and now it had become my sanctuary. One of the first women to move into the home was named Callie, a mother of two who had left a violent relationship. The first night she slept in what used to be my guest room, she woke crying. Not from nightmares, but because she said she felt someone sitting beside her, humming. Hannah told her it must have been the wind through the vent, but I knew better. Then there was little Rosa, a 7-year-old who refused to sleep alone. She told Hannah that the lady in the long dress stood in her doorway at night and whispered, "You're safe now." When Hannah asked what the lady looked like, Rosa said, "She smiles like she knows me." Hannah didn't dismiss her. She just nodded quietly and whispered, "Then she probably does." The mansion became a place of quiet miracles. The women there spoke about feeling braver, calmer, as if the house itself wrapped around them when they cried. When storms rattled the windows, no one felt afraid. When the lights flickered, they laughed and said, "It's just Maren checking in." I liked that the idea that my name was no longer spoken in anger or envy, but with warmth. But not everyone found comfort in my presence. About a year after the foundation opened, Grant broke into the mansion one night. He had been released from prison and was desperate. The newspapers said he'd lost everything, his money, his home, his friends. He'd been spotted near the city, sleeping in motels, drinking too much, muttering about how he'd been robbed. So when he appeared at the gates of my old home, I suppose it was inevitable. It was raining, just as it had been the night I found that envelope of photos. He climbed over the fence, cutting his hands on the iron spikes, and crept through the garden. The security cameras caught him a shadow drenched in rain, limping toward the door like a ghost of his own making. He forced his way inside through the side entrance that once led to my studio. The motion sensors flickered, and the alarm began its low, mechanical hum. But even before the sound filled the house, something else stopped him. He froze in the center of the foyer, his breath visible in the cold air. Later, the guard said he claimed to have heard a voice soft, steady, unmistakable say his name. Grant. He swore the chandelier trembled above him. Though there was no wind, he said the lights dimmed, and he saw me at the top of the staircase, not angry, not vengeful, just watching. Of course, no one believed him. The cameras showed only him standing there, drenched, trembling, whispering to himself before the police arrived. But I know what he saw. Guilt can conjure ghosts as easily as grief can. He was arrested again that night. The papers said he'd broken in to retrieve personal belongings, but everyone knew better. He wasn't looking for things. He was looking for absolution. He didn't find it. After that, no one else ever tried to steal from the mansion. Isla visited once more, this time under a false name. She walked the gardens quietly, avoiding Hannah's gaze. She left flowers under the birch tree lilies, of all things. Maybe she thought it would make up for something. I don't know if Hannah recognized her, but she didn't stop her. She just let her be. The women who lived there continued to thrive. They painted, they wrote, they rebuilt their lives. Each one left a mark on the house, a picture on the wall, a quote above a doorframe, a dream realized. The mansion was no longer a symbol of wealth. It was a living memorial to resilience. At night, Hannah sometimes sat by the window of my old study, sipping tea and talking softly into the air. "If you're still here," she'd say, "thank you." And every time she said it, the curtains would sway just slightly, even when there was no breeze. I wasn't trapped there. I wasn't haunting in the way people feared. I was keeping watch. I'd spent my life surrounded by people who took and took until there was nothing left of me. Now I was surrounded by women who were learning to give to themselves again. I couldn't leave that. Not yet. Some nights I still drift through the halls, tracing the walls I once built around my pain. They don't echo anymore. Hum with laughter, with life, with renewal. One evening, long after the world had stopped talking about me, a new resident found one of my old journals hidden in a drawer. She brought it to Hannah, who read the last line aloud before placing it in the foundation's small museum. It said, "If I ever become a ghost, I hope I haunt the ones who need protection, not the ones who need punishment." And that's exactly what I did. And from the shadows of my old life, I finally found peace among the living. My revenge was never about taking, it was about giving where it mattered. Years passed, and the story of my death slowly evolved into something else. Something that lived beyond the whispers, the gossip, and the greed that had defined the beginning. People stopped calling it the Hallberg scandal and started calling it the Hallberg legacy. My name, once entangled with betrayal and tragedy, became a symbol of transformation. And that was exactly how I wanted to be remembered, not as a victim of my family's cruelty, but as the author of my own justice. It started with a single article. A journalist wrote a feature about the foundation's work, calling it "A Mansion Reborn Through Mercy." The story spread like wildfire. Donations poured in from all over the country, from women who said they saw themselves in me, in my silence, in my pain, in my defiance. They wrote letters to the foundation, each one beginning with the same words. I thought I was alone. The mansion became more than a charity. It became a community. Survivors of domestic abuse, financial manipulation, and emotional neglect found each other under its roof. They held workshops, shared meals, built friendships, and, most importantly, learned to trust again. The same halls that once echoed with the clinking of wine glasses and hollow laughter now filled with the sounds of children playing, women laughing, and the gentle hum of hope. Hannah documented every milestone, not for publicity, but for remembrance. "We need to keep her story alive," she would tell the staff. Not to glorify her pain, but to show what strength can do with it. She was right. Every anniversary of my passing became a day of celebration, not mourning. The foundation held a candlelight event called the Evening of Renewal. where women shared their stories under the birch tree in the garden. Some cried, some laughed, some simply stood in silence. But every single one of them spoke my name with tenderness, not pity. I often imagined standing there among them, unseen but not unfelt, the autumn air cool against my skin, the flicker of candles reflecting in their eyes. I used to think legacies were built on wealth, success, or reputation. But they're not. They're built on echoes, the kind that ripple through other people's lives long after you're gone. Grant's name had long vanished from the papers. The last anyone heard, he was living quietly in a small coastal town, working odd jobs. No one recognized him anymore, which I think was his real punishment to be invisible after spending his life desperate to be admired. Isla's scholarship program thrived, even though she had nothing to do with it. Every year, young women received grants in her name to pursue medical degrees. Many of them sent handwritten notes to the foundation. I never met Dr. Caro, but if she inspired Maren Hallberg, then I'm honored to carry that light. Isla never knew about those letters, but I think part of her would have wept if she had. The irony was beautiful. The name she once tarnished now carried the weight of healing. My parents grew old quietly. They never regained the social status they once flaunted. But they found something else: humility. They began volunteering at the very foundation built from my estate. My mother taught art to children there. My father helped repair furniture and repaint rooms. Hannah told me once, "They never say your name out loud when they're working, but they always look at that birch tree before they start." That was enough. Mr. Farnham eventually retired, his hair silver, his hands still steady. Before stepping down, he visited the mansion one last time. Hannah met him in my old office, where the sunlight poured through the window just as it had the day I recorded my first message. He stood silently for a while, then said, "She outwrote them all." Hannah smiled and replied, "No, sir. She just told the truth, and it finished the story for her." He left behind a framed photograph of me for the office wall, not the polished public portrait from my company days, but a candid one Hannah had taken of me laughing during a lunch break. My hair was messy, my hands were stained with ink, but my eyes were alive. That's how I wanted to be remembered, not perfect, not powerful, just real. Years later, the foundation received a National Award for Humanitarian Service. The president of the board, a woman who had once been one of its residents, stood on stage and said, "This house taught us that love isn't found in who stays when you're strong, but in who stands by you when you're broken." Behind her, projected on the screen, was a photo of my mansion glowing under the evening light. It was strange, even for me, to realize how the story had turned. My death had been the beginning of a storm, but in its aftermath, seeds had grown. The same soil that had buried my body had nourished something living. When Hannah grew older, she started writing her own memoir, not about me directly, but about the women the foundation had helped. Still, every chapter began the same way. This began with a woman named Maren Hallberg, who believed that peace could grow from pain. She refused to make it about tragedy. She made it about triumph. Sometimes, late at night, when the foundation's lights dimmed and the house grew quiet, she'd sit in my study, open her journal, and whisper into the silence, "We did it, Maren. We really did it." And every time, the birch tree outside would sway gently, even when the air was still. I used to think legacy meant control, that if I couldn't have happiness in life, I could at least dictate what came after. But now I see that the best legacies are the ones that slip from your hands and take root on their own. The ones that belong to everyone they touch. Hannah once said, "You can't haunt a house with hate forever. At some point you have to let love move in." I think she was right. The mansion was no longer mine. It belonged to the living, to the women who rebuilt there, to the laughter that filled its walls, to the light that reached even the darkest corners of what I left behind. And even though I was gone, every heartbeat of kindness carried my name forward. If you're hearing this, then my story has finally reached its end. That's how I began my final recording, the one Mr. Farnham kept locked in his safe until the foundation was secure and the mansion was full again. It wasn't meant for lawyers or headlines or revenge. It was meant for anyone who ever wondered what came after. The camera captured me sitting in my favorite armchair by the window, the late afternoon light spilling across my face. I looked calm, older perhaps, but free. "I've told you how greed can hollow a heart," I said, "but what matters now is what fills it afterward." I spoke about forgiveness not as an act of mercy for those who wronged me, but as a final gift to myself. Forgiveness, I said, isn't forgetting. It's remembering without bleeding. I wanted them to understand that even the deepest wounds can close if you stop reopening them. Hannah was there when the recording played for the last time. She stood beside the television, her hands folded, the staff gathered quietly around her. The room glowed with candlelight, not luxury. My words floated through the air like the echo of a lullaby. I used to think legacy was about control, I continued. Now I know it's about release. You can't take your love with you unless you've already given it away. Outside, the birch tree rustled softly, as if the house itself were listening. I told them about the small things that had mattered most to me, my sketchbooks, the smell of rain, the sound of laughter drifting through an open window. I thanked them for keeping those things alive. I thanked Hannah for choosing compassion over comfort, courage over convenience. You were my proof, I said. Proof that goodness doesn't need an audience. I even thanked my family, though they would never hear it directly. To those who broke me, I said, thank you for showing me where the cracks were, because once I saw them, I could finally let the light in. When the recording ended, Hannah didn't speak, for a long time. She just turned off the screen and whispered, "Goodbye, Maren." After that night, the foundation entered a new chapter. Hannah stepped down as director and passed the role to one of the women who had once found refuge there, a young single mother named Callie. The house needs new stories, she said. And it did. Each generation that followed added its own layer of grace to the mansion's walls. Eventually, the world forgot the scandal entirely. Tourists passing through town knew the Hallberg Foundation only as the House of Light. They didn't know about the lies, the affair, the greed. They only knew that hundreds of women had rebuilt their lives there. That was enough. One spring evening, years later, Hannah visited my grave for the last time. The cemetery was quiet, the air thick with the smell of lilacs. She brought a single sunflower, the same kind she'd planted in the garden every year. She knelt by the headstone and traced the inscription carved beneath my name. What you take dies with you. What you give lives forever. She smiled, and in that smile I saw everything I had fought for: peace, purpose, release. She whispered, "You can rest now, we're still building." Then she stood, brushing the dirt from her hands, and walked away, leaving the flower leaning against the stone like a promise kept. I watched her go, and for the first time, I didn't follow. The pull that had kept me tethered to the mansion, to the garden, to the world of the living, began to loosen. The echoes that once bound me turned soft, like a song fading into silence. I drifted one last time through the halls of my old home. The ballroom was filled with laughter, the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. The walls gleamed with framed photographs of women who had come through and left changed. The grand staircase, once a symbol of hierarchy, now carried children running up and down its steps, unafraid. In the study, my desk remained exactly where it had always been. On it sat a single candle burning beside one of my old journals, opened to the final page. A new hand Hannah's had written a line beneath my last entry. She kept her promise. Now we'll keep ours. That was when I knew it was time. I stepped toward the window, where dawn was breaking across the horizon. The first light of morning spilled through the glass, warm and golden. It touched the floors, the walls, the birch tree outside. And then it touched me. I thought about everything that had brought me here, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the pain, and how, somehow, all of it had become the soil from which love had grown. I realized then that I wasn't leaving behind tragedy. I was leaving behind proof that even when the world tries to bury you in darkness, you can still grow roots toward the light. The sound of children laughing drifted in from the garden. It was soft, pure, and endless. I smiled one last time and whispered into the morning, it was worth it. And then, like the final brushstroke on a painting, the light carried me away. And with that, I leave this world knowing I was finally loved for who I truly was.